When Sarah Mitchell pulled into the gravel driveway of the Morrison farmhouse that sweltering August morning, she expected to find another case of simple neglect. What she discovered in the shadow of a rusted tool shed would haunt her forever. The German Shepherd cowered beneath the corrugated metal overhang, his once magnificent frame reduced to jutting ribs and matted fur. Heavy chains bound his neck to a concrete block, the metal worn smooth from months of desperate struggle. But it was his eyes that stopped Sarah's breath. Amber orbs that should have blazed with intelligence now dulled to the color of old pennies, holding a pain so profound it seemed to echo through the Texas heat. Rex had been bred for courage, loyalty, protection. This broken creature barely resembled that noble heritage. As Sarah's boots crunched on the dead grass, one question burned in her mind. What could shatter a dog born to serve and protect? The answer would change 3 lives forever. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Sarah Mitchell had spent the last 6 years of her 28 years pulling broken animals back from the edge of despair. As senior coordinator at Millbrook Animal Sanctuary, she'd seen horrors that would make most people turn away. Puppy mills, fighting rings, cases of neglect that defied human comprehension. But she'd never walked away from a case, not once. Her grandfather, Dr. William Mitchell, used to tell her that some folks were born with hearts too big for their own good. Sarah figured that was probably true. Millbrook, Texas, wasn't the kind of place where secrets stayed buried long. With a population barely scraping 3,000, everybody knew everybody's business, especially when that business involved one of their own veterans. The anonymous tip that morning had come through the sanctuary's hotline at 9:15 sharp, a woman's voice tight with concern. "There's a dog chained up at the Morrison place." "Been hearing it crying for days now." Sarah knew the Morrison name, of course. Everyone in Millbrook did. Jake Morrison had come home from 3 tours in Afghanistan 2 years ago to bury his 6-year-old son Tommy. The boy had died in a car accident while Jake was deployed, and folks said the man never quite recovered from missing those final moments. His wife Elena had packed up and left town 6 months after the funeral, leaving Jake alone in that big farmhouse on the outskirts of town. The drive out to Morrison's place took Sarah through the heart of what used to be oil country. Rusted pump jacks dotted the landscape like mechanical vultures, silent monuments to better times when Millbrook thrived. Now, with the wells mostly dry and jobs scarce, the town held together through sheer stubbornness and the kind of loyalty that ran generations deep. Jake Morrison was a Navy SEAL, the real deal, the kind of man who'd earned his community's respect through blood and sacrifice. Going after a veteran for animal abuse wasn't just professionally risky, it was social suicide in a town where military service meant everything. But Sarah had learned long ago that abused animals didn't care about politics or community standing. They just needed someone to speak for them when they couldn't speak for themselves. The Morrison farmhouse sat at the end of a quarter-mile dirt road, surrounded by 30 acres of scrubland and memories. Once, it had been a showplace. White clapboard siding, wraparound porch, the kind of home where children's laughter echoed through summer evenings. Now, paint peeled from the walls like old skin, and weeds choked the flower beds that Elena Morrison had once tended with such pride. Sarah parked her sanctuary truck beside a battered pickup and stepped into the oppressive heat. Somewhere behind the house she could hear the faint sound of whimpering barely audible above the drone of cicadas in the oak trees. Her heart began to race as she followed the sound, knowing that whatever waited for her in that backyard would test every principle she'd ever held about redemption, forgiveness, and the complicated nature of human brokenness. The metallic rattle of chains guided Sarah around the corner of the farmhouse, past a vegetable garden gone to weeds, and a child's bicycle lying on its side, rust claiming the bright red paint. The sound grew louder as she approached a weathered tool shed, its tin roof reflecting the brutal August sun like a mirror. That's when she saw him. Rex lay curled beneath the overhang, his massive frame reduced to skin stretched over prominent ribs. The heavy logging chain around his neck had worn the fur away completely, leaving raw, weeping sores that attracted lazy flies in the stifling heat. Water bowls sat empty and overturned nearby, and what might have once been food had hardened into an unrecognizable mass covered in ants. "Oh, sweetheart," Sarah whispered, dropping to her knees just outside the chain's reach. The German shepherd's head lifted slightly at her voice, those amber eyes flickering with something that might have been hope before immediately clouding with fear. He pressed himself further into the shadows, a whimper escaping his throat that sounded almost human in its desperation. Sarah had handled hundreds of abuse cases, but something about this dog's suffering cut deeper than usual. German shepherds were bred to serve, to protect, to form unbreakable bonds with their humans. Seeing that loyalty rewarded with chains and neglect felt like witnessing the betrayal of everything sacred about the human-animal bond. "Hey there, beautiful boy," she said softly, extending her hand, palm up. Rex's nostrils flared as he caught her scent, but he remained frozen in place, torn between the desperate need for human contact and the hard-learned lesson that people brought pain. "I'm not going to hurt you, I promise." The screen door of the farmhouse slammed shut with the sound of splintering wood, and heavy footsteps crunched across the gravel. Sarah rose slowly, keeping her movements deliberate and non-threatening as a man emerged from behind the house. Jake Morrison looked like he'd been carved from the same hard-pan soil that surrounded his property, weathered, unyielding, and marked by storms that had left permanent damage. "You're trespassing," he said, his voice carrying the flat authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. He was tall and lean, probably handsome once, but now his face bore the hollow look of a man who'd forgotten how to sleep peacefully. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his clothes hung loose on a frame that had clearly lost significant weight. "I'm Sarah Mitchell from the Animal Sanctuary," she replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. "We received a report about a dog in distress." Jake's gaze flicked to Rex, then back to Sarah, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. "Rex is fine. He's got shelter, food, water. More than some people have." Sarah looked pointedly at the empty water bowls, the festering wounds on Rex's neck, the way the dog cringed at the sound of his owner's voice. "Mr. Morrison, this dog needs immediate medical attention. Those wounds are infected, he's severely underweight, and he's my dog," Jake interrupted, stepping closer. Sarah caught the sharp scent of whiskey on his breath, though his movements remained steady and controlled. "On my property. Which makes this none of your damn business." The tension crackled between them like electricity before a thunderstorm. Sarah had faced down angry dog owners before, but never one whose pain was so raw, so visible beneath the surface aggression. She could see it in the way his hands trembled slightly at his sides, in the careful distance he maintained from Rex, as if getting too close might shatter whatever fragile control he'd managed to construct. "Mr. Morrison, I understand you're a veteran, and I respect your service," Sarah said carefully. "But this animal is suffering. Look at him." For just a moment, Jake's mask slipped. His eyes moved to Rex, and Sarah saw something break inside him, a flash of anguish so profound it took her breath away. Then the walls slammed back up, harder than before. "You don't understand anything," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting. "You come onto my property, judge what you don't comprehend, and think you can fix everything with good intentions and paperwork." Rex whimpered again, pressing himself so far into the corner that Sarah thought he might try to dig through the concrete foundation to escape. The sound seemed to hit Jake like a physical blow, and he took an involuntary step backward. "I'll be back," Sarah said quietly, pulling out her phone to document Rex's condition. With proper authorization. Don't, Jake warned. But there was something hollow in his threat now, as if the fight had suddenly drained out of him. Don't interfere with things you don't understand, Miss Mitchell. Some wounds run too deep for fixing. As Sarah walked back to her truck, Rex's eyes followed her until she disappeared around the corner of the house. Behind her, she heard the soft sound of a man crying, though when she glanced back, Jake Morrison was nowhere to be seen. Sarah's hands shook as she dialed Sheriff Tom Bradley's number from her truck. The images of Rex's condition burned into her memory like a brand. She'd photographed everything she could from the property line, the empty water bowls, the raw wounds around his neck, the way he cowered at the sound of footsteps. But photographs couldn't capture the hopelessness in those amber eyes, the way a creature bred for courage had been reduced to trembling fear. Tom, it's Sarah Mitchell. I need you to meet me at the Morrison place. We've got a situation. The sheriff's heavy sigh carried through the phone line. Sarah, please tell me you're not about to ask me to arrest Jake Morrison for something. A dog, Tom. He's got a German Shepherd chained up back there, and it's bad, real bad. 20 minutes later, Sheriff Bradley's patrol car pulled up behind Sarah's truck, dust swirling in the afternoon heat. Tom Bradley had served 2 tours in Iraq before coming home to wear his father's badge, and the weight of that shared experience with Jake Morrison was written in every reluctant step he took toward the farmhouse. Before we do this, Tom said, adjusting his hat against the glare, there's things you need to know about Jake Morrison. Things that might change how you see this situation. They found Jake sitting on his front porch steps, a beer can dangling from his fingers, staring out at the empty fields like he was seeing ghosts in the heat shimmer. He looked up when they approached, unsurprised, as if he'd been expecting this moment for months. Tommy, Jake said quietly, acknowledging the sheriff with the familiarity of old friendship. Figured she'd bring you eventually. Jake, we need to talk about the dog, Tom said, settling onto the porch step beside his friend. Sarah remained standing, feeling like an outsider in a conversation that carried years of shared understanding. Rex, Jake corrected. His name is Rex. Okay, Rex then. Sarah here says he's in pretty rough shape. Jake's laugh was bitter, hollow. Everything I touch turns to shit, Tommy. You know that better than anyone. Sarah watched the exchange with growing confusion. This wasn't the confrontation she'd expected. No defensiveness, no legal maneuvering, just the quiet conversation of 2 men who'd seen too much of the world's ugliness. Jake legally adopted Rex 8 months ago, Tom said finally, turning to Sarah. Rescued him from a dog-fighting operation we busted outside San Antonio. Rex was in bad shape then, too, torn up, half-starved, didn't trust humans at all. The words hit Sarah like cold water. He rescued him? Jake drove down there the day after we got the call, Tom continued. Said something about how the dog reminded him of... His voice trailed off, eyes flicking to Jake, who had gone very still. Of Tommy, Jake finished quietly. Rex has these eyes, you know. Same color as my boy's. Same way of looking at you like you're the only thing in the world that matters. His voice cracked on the last words, and he took a shaky sip of beer. Sarah felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. Everything she'd assumed about Jake Morrison, about this situation, was crumbling like sand. What happened? She asked softly. Jake was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Tommy died while I was on my 3rd deployment. Car accident on Highway 35. Some drunk driver ran a red light. Elena called me on the satellite phone, but by the time I got home... He shrugged helplessly. Rex was supposed to be Tommy's surprise, his welcome home daddy gift. Jesus, Jake, Tom muttered. Rex was healing real good at first, Jake continued, as if he hadn't heard. Smart as hell, that dog. Could already sit, stay, fetch. Started following me around like he was waiting for something. Or someone. He looked up at Sarah, and she saw the raw pain in his eyes. Problem is, every time I look at him, I see my boy. Every time he does something cute or clever, I think about how Tommy would have loved it. And every time I think about Tommy, the sentence hung unfinished in the air, heavy with implication. The PTSD got worse, Tom explained gently. Elena tried to help, but Jake started pulling away from everyone, including Rex. I didn't mean for it to happen, Jake said, his words slurring slightly. First, I just stopped playing with him. Then I stopped bringing him inside. Then I stopped talking to him altogether. Next thing I knew, he was just another thing I'd failed to protect. Sarah sank down onto the porch steps, her mind reeling. Jake, Rex didn't fail you. You didn't fail him. You both just— You don't get it, Jake interrupted, his voice suddenly sharp. I'm poison, lady. Everything I care about dies or leaves. My unit in Afghanistan, my son, my wife. Rex was supposed to be different. He was supposed to help me heal, and instead I'm killing him by inches. A low whimper drifted from the backyard, and all three of them turned toward the sound. In that moment, Sarah understood that she wasn't dealing with a simple case of animal abuse. This was something far more complex, more heartbreaking. A man and a dog, both broken by loss, both drowning in the same pool of grief. Jake, Tom said carefully. Rex collapsed about 10 minutes before Sarah arrived. He's in bad shape. For the first time since they'd arrived, Jake Morrison looked genuinely afraid. Collapsed? Dehydration, infection, malnutrition, Sarah said, her anger replaced by something that felt uncomfortably like compassion. He needs immediate veterinary care, or we're going to lose him. Jake stared at them for a long moment, then slowly set down his beer and stood. Well, he said quietly, I guess I've finally managed to kill something else I was supposed to protect. The drive to Dr. Michael Torres's veterinary clinic felt like a funeral procession. Jake rode in the passenger seat of Sarah's truck, Rex's unconscious form wrapped in blankets between them, his breathing so shallow it was barely visible. Sarah had seen plenty of animals in critical condition, but watching Jake Morrison stare down at the dog with such naked anguish made her chest tight with unexpected emotion. He used to sleep on Tommy's bed, Jake said suddenly, his voice hoarse. Elena hated it, said dogs belonged in the garage or outside. But Tommy would sneak him upstairs every night, and I'd find them in the morning, that boy's arm wrapped around Rex like he was protecting him from nightmares. Sarah glanced sideways at Jake, noting the way his hands trembled as he gently stroked Rex's matted fur. What changed? Jake was quiet for several blocks, watching the familiar streets of Millbrook roll past the windows. When he finally spoke, his words came out in a rush, like he was afraid he'd lose his nerve if he hesitated. Elena left 6 months after the funeral. Said she couldn't compete with a ghost, couldn't watch me love something dead more than something living. Rex kept waiting by the door every night, tail wagging, thinking Tommy was just running late from school. And I started hating that dog for hoping, for believing Tommy was coming home when I knew he never would. Dr. Michael Torres met them at the clinic's back entrance, his dark eyes immediately assessing Rex's condition as they carried him inside. Sarah had worked with Michael for 3 years, but she'd never seen him look quite so grim as he examined the unconscious German shepherd under the harsh fluorescent lights. "How long has he been like this?" Michael asked, his hands gentle but efficient as he checked Rex's vitals. "Hard to say," Jake replied. I haven't been paying attention like I should." Michael's eyes flicked to Jake, and Sarah caught something pass between the two men, a recognition that went deeper than words. "You're Jake Morrison, right? Navy SEAL?" "Former," Jake corrected. I did 2 tours in Iraq with the army, Michael said quietly. Saw my share of good men come home broken. He returned his attention to Rex, inserting an IV line with practiced efficiency. This dog's got infected wounds, severe dehydration, and he's about 15 pounds underweight, but the worst damage isn't physical. Sarah watched as Michael worked, noting the way Rex remained limp and unresponsive, even to procedures that should have caused some reaction. What do you mean? Look at his eyes when he's conscious, Michael explained, drawing blood for testing. There's no light there, no curiosity. This isn't just physical neglect. This dog has given up. That's the most dangerous condition of all. As if summoned by their conversation, Rex's eyes fluttered open, those amber depths focusing on Jake's face with an expression that broke Sarah's heart. There was no anger there, no fear, just a weary acceptance that seemed to say he understood why he was dying and didn't blame anyone for it. "Hey, boy," Jake whispered, leaning closer to the examination table. Rex's tail gave the faintest twitch, and Jake's face crumpled. "I'm sorry. God, Rex, I'm so fucking sorry." Over the next week, Sarah found herself spending more time at the veterinary clinic than at her own apartment. Rex's physical recovery progressed slowly but steadily. The infections began to clear, he gained a few pounds. The wounds around his neck started to heal, but his spirit remained as broken as ever. He would eat when Sarah hand-fed him, tolerate being touched when necessary for medical care, but there was no spark, no personality, no sign of the intelligent, loyal companion he'd once been. Jake came by every evening after his security shift, sitting quietly beside Rex's kennel and talking to him in low, gentle tones. Sarah started staying late those nights, officially to monitor Rex's progress, but really because she was fascinated by the transformation that came over Jake Morrison when he thought no one was watching. The hard edges softened, the military bearing relaxed, and she could see glimpses of the man Tommy Morrison had called Daddy. "I keep thinking about the day I found him," Jake said one evening, his voice barely audible over the hum of the clinic's air conditioning. Sarah was updating charts at the desk across the room, but she could hear every word. It was a warehouse outside San Antonio, and there must have been 40 dogs there. Most of them were so far gone they couldn't be saved. But Rex, he was different. Even after what they'd done to him, he still had fight left. Rex lifted his head slightly at the sound of his name, those amber eyes focusing on Jake with something that might have been recognition. "The shelter folks said he'd probably never trust humans again," Jake continued. "Said dogs that had been used for fighting were too damaged, too dangerous. But I looked at him, and I swear I could see Tommy in those eyes. Like maybe God was giving me a chance to save something instead of just failing everything I touched." Sarah set down her pen, her throat tight with emotion. Through her research into PTSD and companion animal therapy, she'd learned that the bond between trauma survivors, human and animal, could be incredibly healing. But she'd also learned that trauma could poison that same bond, turning love into a source of fresh pain. "What happened when you first brought him home?" she asked softly. Jake smiled for the first time since she'd met him, the expression transforming his entire face. He was scared of everything. Took him 3 weeks before he'd eat, unless I was sitting right next to his bowl. Took another month before he'd sleep inside instead of hiding under the porch. But Tommy's room, something about that room made him feel safe. He'd go in there and curl up on the rug by the window like he was waiting for someone. "And that didn't bother you?" "At first it was beautiful," Jake said, his smile fading. "Like having a piece of Tommy back. Rex would bring me Tommy's old tennis ball, or curl up in the exact spot where Tommy used to read his books. It felt like maybe Tommy was still with us somehow." Sarah could see where this was heading, could feel the weight of the tragedy that was about to unfold in Jake's words. But then the nightmares got worse, Jake continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. Started having flashbacks during the day. Elena would find me in Tommy's room talking to Rex like he was my son. She said it wasn't healthy, said I was using the dog to avoid dealing with my grief, said I needed professional help. What did you do? Jake laughed bitterly. What I always do. I pushed her away. Pushed everyone away, including Rex. He reached through the kennel bars to touch Rex's head, and the dog leaned into the contact with desperate need. I convinced myself that loving him was making me sicker, that I needed to distance myself to get better. So I stopped talking to him, stopped playing with him, stopped treating him like anything more than an obligation. But you never gave him away. I couldn't, Jake admitted. Every time I thought about calling the shelter, I'd remember how scared he was when I first found him, how much trust it took for him to let me help him. I told myself that keeping him fed and sheltered was enough, that I didn't owe him anything more than survival. Sarah looked at Rex, noting the way he pressed against the kennel bars, trying to get closer to Jake's hand, and felt her heart break a little more. Jake, Rex doesn't need just survival. He needs connection. He needs to know he matters to someone. Yeah, well, Jake said, pulling his hand back and standing abruptly. We both know how well I handle the things that matter to me. As Jake walked toward the clinic door, Rex began to whine, a high, desperate sound that seemed to pierce straight through to Sarah's soul. Jake paused with his hand on the doorknob, his shoulders rigid with tension. He's calling for you, Sarah said quietly. I know, Jake replied without turning around. That's the problem. After Jake left, Sarah sat with Rex for another hour, watching him stare at the door with heartbreaking hope. This wasn't just a case of animal abuse anymore. It was a tragedy of two broken souls who needed each other, but had forgotten how to heal together. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Dr. Torres called Sarah at dawn, his voice tight with urgency. Rex's blood work came back, he said without preamble. Sarah, there's something you need to know about his condition. The blood work results lay spread across Dr. Torres's desk like an indictment, each number telling a story of systematic neglect that made Sarah's stomach churn. But it was the timeline that made everything worse. Rex's decline had accelerated dramatically in the past month, coinciding with what Jake later admitted was his worst stretch since Elena left. His liver enzymes are elevated, kidney function is compromised, and his white blood cell count indicates his immune system is shutting down, Michael explained, his finger tracing the damning evidence. Sarah, this isn't just malnutrition. This dog is dying of a broken heart. Word spread through Millbrook like wildfire, as news always did in small towns where everyone's business became everyone's concern. By noon, Sarah's phone was ringing constantly, concerned citizens wanting to know about that poor dog out at Morrison's place, reporters from the county newspaper asking for statements, and animal rights activists from Austin who'd somehow gotten wind of the story and wanted to organize protests. The division in the community became apparent immediately. At Murphy's Diner, where Sarah stopped for coffee, she overheard heated arguments at nearly every table. The older veterans rallied around Jake Morrison talking about ungrateful civilians who didn't understand what war did to a man's soul. The younger crowd, especially those with children, couldn't comprehend how anyone could abuse an innocent animal regardless of their personal problems. That boy served his country, she heard old Mr. Patterson tell his coffee companions, lost his only child while he was fighting for our freedom. If Jake Morrison wants to keep a dog on his own property, that's his God-given right. At the next table, Jenny Walsh from the elementary school shook her head firmly. I don't care what he's been through. There's no excuse for torturing an animal. None. Sarah found herself caught in the middle of a battle she'd never intended to start. By evening, her sanctuary's phone was ringing with both donations and death threats. Someone had started a Facebook page called Justice for Rex that had gained over 2,000 followers in 6 hours. Another page, Support Our Veterans, featured Jake's military photo and raised questions about Sarah's agenda and whether she understood the sacrifices made by America's heroes. The controversy reached a boiling point when Jake's story made the evening news. A reporter from San Antonio had driven up to Millbrook and somehow obtained footage of Rex's condition, broadcasting images that made grown adults weep. The reporter, a young woman with perfectly styled hair and calculated compassion, stood outside the Morrison farmhouse and spoke directly to the camera. This German Shepherd, a breed known for loyalty and intelligence, has been reduced to this pitiful state by the very man who was supposed to protect him. While we all sympathize with veteran Jake Morrison's tragic loss, the question remains: how many more innocent victims must suffer before we demand accountability? Jake disappeared that night. Sheriff Bradley found him 3 hours later at Tommy's grave in Millbrook Cemetery, drunk and incoherent, clutching his son's framed school photo to his chest like a shield against the world's judgment. "They're right, you know," Jake slurred as Tom helped him to the patrol car. "I'm exactly what they say I am. Failed soldier, failed father, failed human being. Rex deserves better than me." Sarah spent the night at the clinic, watching Rex pace restlessly in his kennel. The dog had grown increasingly agitated since Jake's absence, refusing food and whining constantly. It was nearly 3 in the morning when Michael found her sleeping in the chair beside Rex's kennel, the German Shepherd's paw extending through the bars to rest on her hand. "He's looking for Jake," Michael said quietly, settling into the chair beside her. Dogs like Rex, dogs that have been traumatized and then bonded with someone, they don't just miss their person when they're gone. They grieve like humans do. Sarah rubbed her tired eyes, noting the way Rex watched the clinic door with desperate hope every time a car passed outside. "Michael, what happens if Jake doesn't come back? What happens if this media circus destroys whatever chance they had at healing together?" "Then we lose them both," Michael replied simply. "Jake to his guilt and Rex to his grief." "I've seen it before. PTSD takes soldiers, and sometimes it takes their dogs too." The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Elena Morrison stood in the clinic's waiting room, her dark hair shorter than in the family photos Sarah had seen, her eyes red from crying. Beside her stood an elderly man with Jake's jawline and military bearing, Jake's father, retired Colonel Robert Morrison. "I saw the news," Elena said without preamble. "I came to see Rex." Sarah led them to the back room where Rex lay curled in the corner of his kennel, his head lifting hopefully when he heard footsteps. When he saw Elena, his tail gave a tentative wag, the first sign of happiness Sarah had seen from him in days. "Oh, sweetheart," Elena whispered, kneeling beside the kennel. Rex pressed against the bars, whining softly as she stroked his head. "I'm so sorry." "I'm so sorry I left you with him when I knew he was drowning." Colonel Morrison stood rigidly behind his daughter-in-law, his weathered face betraying no emotion as he studied the dog his son had failed to protect. "How bad is he?" "Physically, he'll recover," Sarah replied carefully. "Emotionally, that depends on whether he has something to live for." "And my son?" Sarah met the older man's steady gaze, seeing echoes of Jake in the set of his jaw, the way he held his shoulders. "Your son is a good man who's been broken by loss. Rex was supposed to help him heal, but trauma doesn't always work that way. Sometimes it makes people hurt the things they love most." Elena's voice was thick with tears. "Jake told me once that Rex reminded him of Tommy." Same eyes, same way of looking at you like you hung the moon. I thought it was sweet at first, but then I realized Jake wasn't just seeing Tommy and Rex, he was trying to replace Tommy with Rex. That's not possible, Colonel Morrison said gruffly. No, it's not, Elena agreed. And when Jake realized that, when he understood that Rex couldn't bring Tommy back or fill that hole in his heart, he started resenting him, started punishing him for not being what Jake needed him to be. Rex whimpered softly, pressing closer to Elena's hand. For a moment, Sarah thought she saw a flicker of his old intelligence in those amber eyes, as if he understood they were talking about his fate. "What do you want to do?" Sarah asked Elena. "I want to take him," Elena said firmly. "I've got a place in Dallas, good veterinary care, and She paused, looking down at Rex with something that might have been love. "I failed him once, by leaving. I won't fail him again." Sarah felt her heart sink. Legally, Elena probably had a strong case. Abandonment by Jake could constitute grounds for transfer of ownership, especially with the animal abuse charges that were almost certainly coming. But watching Rex press against the kennel bars, still looking toward the door for Jake, she knew that removing him from Millbrook might save his life but destroy his spirit entirely. "Elena," she said carefully, "Rex isn't just bonded to this place. He's bonded to Jake. Despite everything that's happened, despite the neglect and pain, Rex still loves him. Taking him away might be the kindest thing for everyone involved, but it might also be the thing that kills him." "What's the alternative?" Colonel Morrison demanded. "Leave him with my son so Jake can finish the job?" Before Sarah could answer, the clinic door chimed, and Sheriff Bradley entered with Jake behind him. Jake looked terrible, unshaven, hollow-eyed, wearing the same clothes he'd had on when Tom found him at the cemetery. But when he saw Elena and his father, something shifted in his posture, a straightening of shoulders that spoke to military training that ran deeper than conscious thought. Rex went completely still, his amber eyes locked on Jake's face. For a long moment, the room was silent, except for the hum of medical equipment and the distant sound of traffic on Main Street. "Elena," Jake said quietly. "Dad." "Jacob," his father replied, the single word carrying decades of disappointment and expectations that had never quite been met. Elena stood slowly, her hand still resting on Rex's head. "I came to take him home, Jake, to give him the life he deserves." Jake's eyes moved to Rex, and Sarah saw the exact moment when something broke inside him. "Yeah," he said, his voice barely audible. That's probably best." But Rex had other ideas. With a strength that surprised everyone, he lunged against the kennel door, barking frantically. Not the frightened whimpers they'd grown accustomed to, but deep, commanding barks that demanded attention. When Jake instinctively stepped toward the kennel, Rex quieted immediately, pressing against the bars with his whole body, tail wagging for the first time in weeks. "Jesus," Elena whispered. "He's choosing you, Jake. Even after everything, he's still choosing you." The moment Jake opened Rex's kennel door, everything changed. The German Shepherd launched himself forward with a desperation that spoke to months of separation and grief, his weakened body trembling as he pressed against Jake's legs. But instead of the joyful reunion Sarah had expected, Jake stood frozen, his hands hovering inches from Rex's head, as if touching the dog might cause them both to shatter. "I can't," Jake whispered, his voice breaking. "I can't do this anymore." Rex whined softly, pawing at Jake's legs, those amber eyes searching his face with an intelligence that cut straight through to Sarah's heart. The dog knew something was wrong, could sense the finality in Jake's posture, the way he held himself like a man preparing to walk away from everything he'd ever loved. "Jake," Elena said gently, stepping closer, "maybe we should talk about this. All of us. But Jake was already backing toward the door, his face a mask of anguish and self-loathing. "There's nothing to talk about. You were right to leave, Elena. You were right about everything. I destroy what I touch, and I won't do it to him anymore." "Son," Colonel Morrison spoke for the first time since Jake's arrival, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to command. "You don't run from responsibility. I didn't raise you to be a quitter." The words hit Jake like a physical blow, and Sarah saw his entire body recoil. "Responsibility?" He laughed bitterly. "Is that what you call this? I let my boy die while I was playing soldier halfway around the world. I drove away my wife because I couldn't figure out how to live with my guilt, and now I've nearly killed the one thing that might have saved me. What part of that sounds like responsibility to you?" The pain in Jake's voice was so raw, so exposed, that Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. But it was Rex's reaction that truly broke her heart. The dog was trying to follow Jake toward the door, his weakened legs struggling to support his weight, small whimpers of distress escaping his throat. "Jake, look at him," Sarah said urgently. "Really look at him." But Jake refused to turn around, his hand already on the door handle. "I've looked at him every day for 8 months, watching him waste away because of what I am. I won't watch him die because I'm too selfish to let him go." That's when Rex collapsed. The German shepherd's leg simply gave out, his body hitting the clinic floor with a sound that made everyone in the room flinch. But he didn't stay down. With a determination that spoke to his breeding, to generations of loyalty bred into his bones, Rex began dragging himself across the floor toward Jake, his hind legs useless, but his front paws scrabbling for purchase on the smooth linoleum. "Oh my God," Elena breathed, her hand flying to her mouth. "Doctor." Torres rushed forward, but Sarah caught his arm. "Wait," she said quietly. "Let him choose." Rex's breathing was labored, his tongue lolling from the effort, but he never stopped moving toward Jake. The sound of his claws scratching against the floor filled the room like fingernails on a chalkboard, desperate and heartbreaking. When he finally reached Jake's feet, Rex lifted his head with the last of his strength and rested his muzzle against Jake's boot. Jake crumpled. The sound that came from him was something between a sob and a scream, a noise so primal and broken that it seemed to echo from the depths of his soul. He dropped to his knees beside Rex, gathering the dog into his arms with the careful tenderness of a man holding something precious and fragile. "I'm sorry," Jake whispered into Rex's fur, tears streaming down his face. "I'm so sorry, boy. I never meant to hurt you. I couldn't figure out how to love you without it killing me." Rex's tail gave the faintest wag, and he turned his head to lick Jake's face with what little strength he had left. The gesture was so gentle, so forgiving, that Sarah had to turn away from the intensity of the moment. "He's not just choosing you," Elena said softly, kneeling beside them both. "He's forgiving you. Maybe it's time you learned to forgive yourself." But Colonel Morrison had a different perspective. "Forgiveness doesn't fix anything," he said harshly. "That dog is dying because of your weakness, Jacob. Your inability to handle what life threw at you." Jake's head snapped up, his eyes blazing with a fury that transformed his entire face. "My weakness? You want to talk about weakness, old man? Where were you when I came home broken? Where were you when I was drowning in nightmares and guilt? Too busy being disappointed in me to notice I needed help? I needed you to be strong. I needed you to be my father," Jake shouted, his voice echoing off the clinic walls. "I needed someone to tell me it was okay to grieve my son, okay to ask for help, okay to be human instead of a perfect soldier. Instead, you taught me that showing emotion was weakness, that asking for help was failure, that real men suffer in silence." Sarah watched the exchange with growing understanding. This wasn't just about Jake and Rex. This was about generations of Morrison men who'd been taught that love was weakness, that vulnerability was failure, that true strength meant carrying your pain alone. And look where that got us, Jake continued, his voice dropping to a whisper as he looked down at Rex. I'm 34 years old, and I still don't know how to love something without destroying it. I still don't know how to let people help me without feeling like I've failed. Rex lifted his head with obvious effort, those amber eyes focusing on Jake's face with such intensity that everyone in the room held their breath. The dog's tail gave another weak wag, and he made a soft sound. Not quite a whine, not quite a whimper, but something that sounded almost like he was trying to speak. He's trying to tell you something, Elena said softly. Dr. Torres knelt beside them, his professional demeanor giving way to something more human. Jake, Rex's collapse isn't necessarily fatal. His body is shutting down from stress and grief, but if he has something to fight for, something to live for. I can't be that thing, Jake said desperately. Don't you understand? Everything I love dies or leaves. My mother, my unit, Tommy, Elena, I'm poison to anything good in this world. That's not true, Sarah said firmly, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. Jake, you saved Rex from that fighting ring. You gave him 8 months of life he wouldn't have had otherwise. Yes, you made mistakes. Yes, you both got lost in grief. But love isn't about being perfect. It's about showing up, even when you're broken. Colonel Morrison made a sound of disgust. Sentimental nonsense. The boy needs discipline, not coddling. No, Elena said sharply, standing to face her former father-in-law. What Jake needs is permission to be human. What he needs is someone to tell him that it's okay to hurt, okay to fail, okay to need help healing. Rex struggled to lift his head again, his eyes moving between Jake and the others as if he understood every word being spoken. When Jake gently stroked his head, the dog leaned into the touch with such obvious relief that Sarah felt fresh tears spill down her cheeks. I don't know how to fix this, Jake admitted, his voice small and lost. I don't know how to be what he needs. You don't have to fix anything, Sarah said gently. You just have to be willing to heal together, both of you. Dr. Torres cleared his throat. There's something else we need to discuss. Jake, Rex's condition is critical, but it's not hopeless. However, he's going to need intensive care, medication, and most importantly, he's going to need emotional support. If you're serious about this, about really trying to save him, it can't be half-hearted. Rex needs to know you're committed to him, that you're not going to disappear again. Jake looked down at Rex, who had somehow found the strength to rest his paw on Jake's arm. The simple gesture, so trusting, so forgiving, seemed to crack something open inside Jake's chest. I don't deserve him, Jake whispered. Maybe not, Sarah replied honestly, but he's choosing you anyway. The question is, are you going to choose him back? The room fell silent except for Rex's labored breathing and the distant sound of Millbrook going about its evening business. In that quiet moment, Sarah could almost see the battle raging inside Jake Morrison, between the man his father had raised him to be and the man he needed to become to save both himself and the dog in his arms. 3 days later, Rex stopped breathing. Sarah was sleeping in the chair beside his kennel when the alarm started screaming, the heart monitor's shrill warning cutting through the pre-dawn quiet like a knife. Dr. Torres appeared within seconds, his hands moving with practiced efficiency as he worked to resuscitate the German shepherd whose body had finally given up the fight. "Come on, Rex," Michael muttered, compressing the dog's chest with rhythmic precision. "Don't you dare quit on us now." Sarah called Jake from the clinic's landline, her hands shaking as she dialed the number she'd memorized over the past 72 hours. He'd been staying at the clinic almost constantly since Rex's collapse, sleeping on the floor beside the kennel, hand-feeding him water with a syringe, talking to him in the soft, broken voice of a man learning how to hope again. "Sarah?" Jake's voice was thick with sleep and immediately alert with fear. "You need to get here now," she said simply. Jake arrived, still wearing yesterday's clothes, his hair wild from sleep, his eyes immediately seeking Rex's still form on the examination table. Dr. Torres was working over the dog with quiet intensity, but Sarah could see the resignation beginning to creep into his movements. "How long?" Jake asked, his voice eerily calm. "4 minutes without a heartbeat," Michael replied without looking up. "I'm trying everything, Jake, but—" "Let me," Jake interrupted, moving to the table. He placed his hands on Rex's chest, not to perform CPR, but simply to connect, to let the dog feel his presence. "Rex, you stubborn son of a bitch, don't you dare leave me. Not now. Not when I finally figured out how to fight for you." For a moment, nothing happened. The heart monitor continued its flat, monotonous wail, and Sarah felt something inside her chest begin to crack. But then, impossibly, Rex's eyes fluttered open. The heart monitor hiccuped, skipped, and suddenly began beating again, weak and irregular, but beating. "Jesus Christ," Michael breathed, staring at the monitor in disbelief. "In 30 years of veterinary medicine, I've never seen anything like that." Rex's gaze found Jake's face, and his tail gave the faintest twitch. A gesture so small it was barely visible, but to Jake it might as well have been a symphony. Tears streamed down Jake's face as he leaned closer, pressing his forehead gently against Rex's. "I'm here, boy," he whispered. "I'm not going anywhere. We're going to fight this together. Okay? Both of us." But Rex's miraculous return from the edge wasn't the end of their crisis. It was the beginning of their hardest test yet. Word of the dramatic resuscitation spread through Millbrook like wildfire, and by noon, the clinic was surrounded by news vans and protesters. The Justice for Rex crowd had grown larger and more vocal, their signs demanding Jake's arrest and Rex's removal. Counter-protesters waved American flags and held signs reading "Support our veterans" and "PTSD is real." The media attention had attracted the state animal welfare authorities, who arrived that afternoon with legal documents and grim expressions. Sarah watched through the clinic window as a stern-faced woman in a government suit spoke with Sheriff Bradley, gesturing toward the building where Rex lay fighting for his life. "Miss Mitchell?" The woman introduced herself as Director Janet Walsh from the Texas Department of Animal Welfare. "I'm here to investigate allegations of criminal animal abuse and to determine the appropriate placement for the German Shepherd known as Rex." Sarah felt her heart sink. "Rex is in critical condition. Moving him right now could kill him." "I understand your concern," Director Walsh replied, her tone professionally sympathetic but unyielding. "However, we have documented evidence of severe neglect and abuse. The animal's welfare must be our primary consideration." "And what about Jake Morrison's welfare?" Dr. Torres asked, joining the conversation. "I'm telling you as a medical professional that separating these two right now could be fatal for both of them." Director Walsh consulted her clipboard with bureaucratic efficiency. "Mr. Morrison's mental health concerns are not within my jurisdiction. My responsibility is to ensure that this animal receives proper care and is placed in a safe environment." That's when Jake emerged from the back room, his face pale but determined. "I want to make a statement," he said quietly. The official interviews took place in Dr. Torres's office, with Jake, Sarah, Director Walsh, and Sheriff Bradley crowded around the small space. A court reporter had been summoned to document everything, her fingers flying over the stenography machine as Jake began to speak. "My name is Jacob Morrison, and I want to tell you about the worst thing I've ever done," Jake began, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Worse than anything that happened in Afghanistan, worse than failing to save my brothers, worse than not being there when my son died." Director Walsh leaned forward, clearly expecting a confession that would make her job simple. The worst thing I ever did, Jake continued, was give up on love. When my son Tommy died, I decided that caring about anything was too dangerous, too painful. So I stopped caring about my wife, stopped caring about my friends, stopped caring about myself. And when Rex came into my life, this incredible, loyal, intelligent dog who deserved nothing but love, I stopped caring about him too. Sarah watched Jake's face as he spoke, seeing the raw honesty there, the willingness to expose his worst moments to strangers who held his future in their hands. I didn't hit Rex, Jake said clearly. I didn't kick him or beat him or torture him. What I did was worse. I ignored him. I took a dog bred for loyalty and companionship and I made him invisible. I fed him enough to keep him alive and told myself that was enough. I chained him up and convinced myself it was for his own good. Mr. Morrison, Director Walsh interrupted, you're essentially confessing to criminal neglect. Yes, Jake said simply. I am. But I'm also telling you that Rex and I are fighting our way back to each other. These past 3 days, I've remembered what it feels like to love something more than I fear losing it. And Rex, God, Rex has shown me forgiveness I don't deserve. That's very touching, Director Walsh replied, but it doesn't change the fact that you've demonstrated an inability to properly care for this animal. Sarah felt her temper flare. With respect, Director Walsh, you're looking at this situation completely wrong. This isn't about removing Rex from an abusive situation. It's about healing 2 trauma survivors who need each other. Miss Mitchell, I appreciate your advocacy, but no, listen to me, Sarah interrupted, surprising herself with her own vehemence. I've worked animal rescue for 6 years. I've seen every kind of abuse, every kind of neglect. This isn't that. This is 2 broken souls who lost their way and are finding their way back together. Dr. Torres cleared his throat. If I may add a medical perspective, he said formally, Rex's current condition is directly related to his emotional state. His physical symptoms, the heart failure, the immune system collapse, they're manifestations of what we call broken heart syndrome. It's a real medical condition that affects both humans and animals who've experienced severe emotional trauma. Are you saying the dog is literally dying of a broken heart? Director Walsh asked skeptically. That's exactly what I'm saying, Michael replied. And separating him from Jake right now, when they're both beginning to heal, could trigger a complete system shutdown. I'm not speaking metaphorically. I'm giving you my professional medical opinion that removing Rex from Jake's care could kill him. The room fell silent except for the soft sound of the court reporter's machine and the distant noise of protesters outside. Director Walsh studied her paperwork for what felt like hours, occasionally glancing up at Jake with an expression Sarah couldn't read. Mr. Morrison, she said finally, if I were to allow Rex to remain in your care, what assurances can you give me that this neglect won't happen again? Jake was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, as if he was choosing each one with careful precision. I can't promise I won't have bad days, he said. I can't promise the PTSD will magically disappear, or that I'll never struggle with depression again. What I can promise is that I'll never stop fighting for him. I can promise that I'll get the help I need, therapy, medication, whatever it takes, so that I can be the man Rex deserves. That's not enough, Director Walsh said firmly. The state requires more concrete assurances. Sarah felt panic rising in her chest, but Jake held up a hand to stop her from speaking. Then I'll give you something concrete, Jake said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a folded piece of paper. This is a deed transferring ownership of my property to the Millbrook Animal Sanctuary. Sarah Mitchell will have full legal authority over Rex's care, with me as his designated caregiver under her supervision. Sarah stared at him in shock. "Jake, you can't." "I can, and I am," Jake said firmly. "I'm putting my money where my mouth is, Director Walsh. If I fail Rex again, Sarah has the authority to remove him from my care immediately. But until that happens, we heal together." The gesture was so unexpected, so selfless, that even Director Walsh seemed stunned. Outside, the protesters continued their chanting, unaware that the man they were vilifying had just given up everything he owned to save the dog they claimed to champion. "This is highly unusual," Director Walsh said finally. "So is love," Jake replied simply. "But Rex taught me that unusual doesn't mean impossible." 6 months later, Sarah stood in the morning sunshine outside what had once been the Morrison farmhouse and marveled at the transformation. The peeling paint had been replaced with warm yellow siding, the broken porch steps rebuilt with sturdy oak planks, and the dead garden now bloomed with sunflowers that turned their faces toward the light like grateful prayers. A hand-carved wooden sign by the front gate read, "Tommy's House, a sanctuary for heroes," with smaller text below, "Healing happens here." Rex bounded across the front yard with the enthusiasm of a dog half his age, his coat gleaming with health, his amber eyes bright with purpose. At 4.5 years old, he'd filled out to his proper weight, his magnificent German shepherd frame moving with the confident grace of an animal who knew he was loved. The raw wounds around his neck had healed to thin, white scars, barely visible beneath his thick fur. Battle marks that told a story of survival and redemption. "Rex, easy boy," Jake called from the porch, but his tone held nothing but affection. The man who emerged from the house bore little resemblance to the broken veteran Sarah had first encountered in this same yard. Jake had gained back the weight he'd lost to grief and alcohol. His shoulders no longer carried the permanent slump of defeat, and when he smiled, which he did often now, it reached his eyes. The transformation hadn't been easy or quick. The first month after Director Walsh's reluctant approval had been touch and go, with Rex suffering setbacks that sent him back to the emergency clinic twice. Jake had slept on the floor of the veterinary office for 3 weeks straight, refusing to leave Rex's side even when Sarah and Dr. Torres insisted he needed rest. "He came back from the dead for me," Jake had said during one of those long nights, his hand resting gently on Rex's sleeping form. "The least I can do is show him the same commitment." The breakthrough had come gradually, like sunrise creeping across the Texas landscape. Rex began eating regularly, then playing with toys Jake brought him, then following commands with the eager precision of a dog bred for service. More importantly, Jake had begun attending therapy sessions with Dr. Elena Vasquez, a specialist in veteran PTSD, who understood that healing trauma required confronting it, not burying it. "Jake, the vets are here for the group session," Sarah called from the kitchen, where she was preparing lunch for the day's residents. Tommy's house now served as a residential facility for 8 military veterans struggling with PTSD and their companion animals, dogs, cats, even a retired military horse named Captain, who'd been rescued from a neglect situation similar to Rex's. The program had started small, just Jake and Rex working with Dr. Vasquez in the farmhouse living room. But word had spread through veteran networks, and soon other broken soldiers were arriving with their equally broken animals, seeking the kind of healing that could only happen when trauma survivors helped each other. Sarah watched through the window as Jake walked across the yard toward the converted barn that now served as the group therapy center. Rex trotted beside him with the focused attention of a working dog, but also with the easy familiarity of a beloved companion. Their bond had evolved beyond simple ownership into something deeper, a partnership built on mutual healing and unwavering loyalty. The success stories that had emerged from Tommy's house over the past months read like miracles. There was Marcus, a Marine who'd lost his leg in Fallujah and found purpose again, training rescue dogs for other disabled veterans. There was Lisa, an Army medic whose service dog Bella had been returned to her original trauma state by an abusive boyfriend. Both woman and dog had rediscovered their strength through the program's combination of therapy and meaningful work. But it was the story of Jake and Rex that drew the most attention. The national media that had once vilified Jake as an animal abuser now held him up as an example of redemption and the healing power of the human-animal bond. 60 Minutes had done a feature story, People magazine had put them on the cover, and Jake's book, The Dog Who Saved a Soldier, had become a bestseller that funded the sanctuary's expansion. "The irony isn't lost on me," Jake had told Sarah one evening as they watched Rex play with a litter of German Shepherd puppies sired by him and born to a rescued female. "I spent months trying to figure out how to stop loving Rex because it hurt too much. Now I'm teaching other people that love is the only thing that can heal that kind of hurt." The afternoon brought a special visitor, Elena Morrison, who'd moved back to Texas and was considering taking a position as Tommy's house program coordinator. Her relationship with Jake remained complicated, built more on shared grief than romantic love, but she'd become Rex's fiercest advocate and Jake's strongest supporter in his healing journey. "How's he doing?" Elena asked Sarah, nodding toward the barn where Jake was leading a session with 5 veterans and their animals. "See for yourself," Sarah replied, leading Elena to the observation window Dr. Vasquez had installed so family members could witness the therapy process. Inside, Jake sat in a circle with the other veterans, Rex lying calmly at his feet, while the other animals, 3 dogs, a cat, and a parakeet named Freedom, provided comfort to their humans as they shared their stories. Sarah watched Jake's face as he listened to Marcus talk about survivor's guilt, noting the way Jake's hand unconsciously moved to rest on Rex's head whenever the discussion grew particularly intense. "The thing about trauma," Jake was saying, his voice carrying the hard-won wisdom of someone who'd fought his way back from the brink, "is that it lies to you. It tells you that caring about anything is too dangerous, that love will only lead to loss. Rex taught me that love isn't about avoiding loss. It's about choosing to care anyway, even when caring hurts." Rex lifted his head at the sound of his name, those intelligent amber eyes scanning the room as if assessing the emotional temperature of the group. When he spotted a new veteran named David struggling with tears, Rex rose and walked over to him, gently placing his head on the man's lap in the universal dog gesture of comfort. "He does that," Jake said softly, watching Rex work his therapy magic. "He seems to know exactly who needs him most in any given moment. Sometimes I think he understands PTSD better than most doctors do." Elena wiped tears from her eyes as she watched the interaction. "Jake's right," she told Sarah. "Rex doesn't just provide comfort. He provides purpose. Jake needed something to protect, something to care for, something that depended on him. Rex needed someone who understood that healing isn't linear, that some days you take steps backward before you can move forward." As the afternoon session ended, Sarah found herself reflecting on the miraculous chain of events that had brought them all to this moment. It had started with a phone call about an abused dog and had evolved into something none of them could have imagined, a healing community where trauma survivors, both human and animal, found their way back to wholeness together. The real test had come 3 months earlier when Jake's father, Colonel Morrison, had finally visited Tommy's house. The old soldier had walked through the facility with military precision, inspecting the living quarters, the therapy spaces, and the animal care facilities with the critical eye of someone who'd spent his life evaluating operations. "This is good work, son," he'd said finally, the simple words carrying more healing power than any elaborate apology. "Your mother would be proud. Tommy would be proud." Now, As Sarah watched Jake emerge from the therapy barn with Rex trotting beside him, both of them surrounded by veterans and animals who'd found hope in the most unlikely place, she felt the deep satisfaction of witnessing true transformation. The scared, broken dog she'd discovered chained behind a farmhouse had become a beacon of healing for others. The angry, grief-stricken veteran who'd once pushed away everything he loved had become a teacher, showing others that redemption was possible even in the darkest circumstances. "Ready for the dedication ceremony?" Jake asked as he approached, Rex immediately moving to greet Sarah with the enthusiasm of a dog who'd learned that humans could be trusted again. Tomorrow would mark the official opening of the Tommy Morrison Memorial Garden, a peaceful space where veterans and their animals could find quiet moments of reflection and healing. The centerpiece would be a bronze statue of a child and a German shepherd, commissioned by Elena and inscribed with words Jake had written, "Love doesn't end with loss. It transforms into something stronger." As if sensing the importance of the moment, Rex sat perfectly still while Sarah scratched behind his ears, his tail wagging with the quiet contentment of a dog who knew he was exactly where he belonged. Sometimes the greatest love stories aren't between two people. They're between broken souls who refuse to give up on each other. Jake Morrison came home from war carrying invisible wounds that nearly destroyed everything he touched, including Rex, a loyal German shepherd who deserved nothing but love. What started as a rescue became a tragedy of neglect, but ended as a testament to the healing power of unconditional forgiveness. In a world that often feels divided and harsh, Rex chose love over resentment, hope over despair, and showed us that second chances aren't just possible, they're sacred. Their journey from abandonment to redemption reminds us that it's never too late to choose love, to seek help, or to believe that tomorrow can be better than today. As we face our own struggles with loss, disappointment, or feeling forgotten, Rex and Jake's story whispers a powerful truth. Healing happens when we stop running from our pain and start walking toward it together. Every veteran deserves support, every animal deserves compassion, and every human heart deserves the chance to love again. Share your thoughts. Have you ever witnessed the healing power of the bond between a person and their pet? What moment in this story touched your heart the most? Please leave a comment below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. The sun was setting over Tommy's house as Sarah walked through the memorial garden 1 year after its dedication, Rex padding silently beside her with the dignified bearing of a dog who'd learned his worth through trial and transformation. The bronze statue gleamed in the golden light, its inscription catching the last rays of day. Love doesn't end with loss. It transforms into something stronger. Around them, the sanctuary buzzed with quiet activity. Veterans tending to animals, therapy sessions winding down, the peaceful rhythm of lives being rebuilt one day at a time. The garden had become more than Sarah had ever imagined when she'd first sketched the plans. What was meant to be a simple memorial to Tommy Morrison had evolved into a living testament to resilience, featuring winding paths lined with native Texas wildflowers, meditation benches donated by grateful families, and a reflecting pool where visitors could find moments of peace. But it was the wall of healing that drew the most attention, a curved stone structure where visitors left messages of hope, photographs of their own beloved animals, and testimonies to the power of love conquering trauma. "Another one," Jake said softly, pointing to a fresh addition to the wall. Someone had left a framed photo of an elderly man in a wheelchair with a small terrier on his lap, accompanied by a handwritten note. "Charlie saved my dad's life after Mom died." Animals understand grief in ways humans sometimes can't. Thank you for showing the world that healing is possible. Rex approached the wall with interest, his nose twitching as he investigated the new scent. Over the past year, he'd become something of a celebrity, featured in documentaries about animal therapy and PTSD recovery, but fame hadn't changed his fundamental nature. He remained what he'd always been, a dog who understood that his purpose was to love and be loved, to offer comfort without judgment, to stand steady when the humans in his life were falling apart. "Dr. Vasquez wants to talk to us about the expansion," Jake said, settling onto one of the benches with the easy movement of a man who'd learned to carry his grief without letting it crush him. Rex immediately took his position beside Jake's left leg, a habit that had developed during Jake's worst nightmares when the dog would position himself as a living anchor to the present moment. The expansion plans were ambitious. A second facility in Oklahoma, partnerships with VA hospitals across the Southwest, and a training program that would certify other locations to replicate the Tommy's House model. What had started as one man's desperate attempt to save his relationship with his dog had grown into a movement that was changing how America treated its veterans and their animal companions. Sarah pulled out her phone to check the latest statistics that still amazed her. Over 300 veterans had completed the program, with a 94% success rate in maintaining stable housing and employment after graduation. More importantly, the suicide rate among program participants was virtually zero, a statistic that spoke to the life-saving power of the work they were doing. "Elena called," Jake continued, his voice carrying the warmth that always crept in when he spoke of his ex-wife. Their relationship had evolved into something deeper than romance but stronger than friendship, a partnership built on shared purpose and the recognition that some bonds transcend traditional categories. The funding came through for the mobile units. The mobile units were Elena's brainchild, veterinary clinics on wheels that would travel to rural areas where veterans and their animals couldn't access traditional services. Each unit would be staffed by a veterinarian, a therapist, and a program graduate who could speak from experience about the healing journey. Rex's ears perked up at the sound of approaching footsteps, and he rose to greet Dr. Vasquez with the enthusiasm of a dog who'd learned to associate her visits with good things happening. The therapist had become more than a professional consultant. She was family, one of the growing circle of people who'd been transformed by their connection to Tommy's house. "Jake, Sarah," Dr. Vasquez called out, her arms full of folders and her face bright with excitement. "I have news that's going to knock your socks off." She settled onto the bench across from them, Rex immediately moving to rest his head on her knee with the shameless confidence of a dog who knew he was universally adored. "The Department of Veterans Affairs wants to make our program the national model for animal-assisted PTSD therapy. Full funding, nationwide implementation, the works." Sarah felt her breath catch. The recognition they'd been working toward for months was finally within reach, but the implications were staggering. "How many facilities are we talking about?" 50 locations in the first phase, with plans for expansion to every state within 5 years, Dr. Vasquez replied, her smile growing wider as she watched their reactions. "Jake, they want you to head up the program. National Director, full authority to establish standards and training protocols." Jake was quiet for a long moment, his hand automatically moving to stroke Rex's head as he processed the magnitude of what was being offered. Sarah watched his face, seeing the flicker of the old fear, the voice that whispered he wasn't worthy of such responsibility, that he'd somehow find a way to fail everyone who was counting on him. But then Rex looked up at him with those amber eyes that had seen Jake at his worst and chosen to love him anyway, and something shifted in Jake's expression. The doubt didn't disappear entirely. Sarah suspected it never would, but it was overshadowed by something stronger, the quiet confidence of a man who'd learned to trust himself again. "There's a condition," Jake said finally. "Rex comes with me to every site visit, every training session, every meeting. He's not just my companion. He's the living proof that this program works. People need to see what healing looks like. Dr. Vasquez laughed, reaching down to scratch behind Rex's ears. "I think they'd be disappointed if you showed up without him. Rex has become the unofficial mascot of the entire movement." As if he understood he was being discussed, Rex straightened with pride, his tail wagging with the measured dignity of a dog who knew his worth. The transformation was complete. The broken, cowering animal Sarah had found chained behind a farmhouse had become a symbol of hope for veterans across the country. "There's something else," Dr. Vasquez continued, her voice growing softer. "The Morrison Family Foundation wants to endow a scholarship program. Full funding for veterinary students who commit to working with military animals and their handlers. They're calling it the Rex Fellowship." The news hit Sarah like a warm wave, washing over the last of her doubts about the path they'd chosen. From the moment she'd first seen Rex cowering in Jake's backyard, she'd known there was something special about this particular case. But she'd never imagined it would grow into something that could touch thousands of lives. As the three of them sat in the gathering twilight, planning the future of a movement that had started with one phone call about a neglected dog, Rex settled into his favorite position, sprawled across their feet like a living reminder that love, once given freely, creates bonds that can't be broken by time or distance or the inevitable challenges of life. The dedication ceremony had ended, but the real celebration was just beginning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new veterans to help, new animals to heal. But tonight, in the peace of Tommy's garden, surrounded by the quiet sounds of a sanctuary at rest, Sarah felt the deep satisfaction of work that mattered, love that endured, and the certain knowledge that some stories are too powerful to end, they just transform into something stronger.